Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator, Karl Cassell. During the last few election cycles, we have had a consistent message broadcast that socialism is coming and we should beware. Individuals like Senator Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have become the face of and have championed the cause of a revamped economic situation in America. Today, we will be discussing the topic of democratic socialism and if it would be a detriment to the current capitalist structure we have in America. We have joining us today three varying perspectives that can offer balance to the often used echo chambers that only provide limited talking points. Let me introduce you to Karen Hubby, business owner and democratic socialist feminist. Good morning.
Hello. My name is Karen Kubby.
Thank you, Karen. And Tim Hagle, political scientist from the University of Iowa.
Morning.
Thank you. And Drew Westberg, an economist at Coe College.
Morning.
Good morning. And so we want to start with just a question to kind of give people context. What does democratic socialism really mean, and could it work in America?
I think on a very broad definition of democratic socialism is one where there is more social control and ownership of economic elements. And I would have to say that I think the United States is a very mixed economy at this point. It's definitely a capitalist and free market economy, but there are so many things that are placed upon that really are socialist in nature. Some of them socialist for the elite, which is not really the kind of democratic socialism I'm interested in. But there are lots of other institutions within local governments and within local economies that would be defined as democratic socialism.
Anyone else want to follow up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Karen makes a really good point that like this is already here, but it's been here for a very long time. Even right here in Iowa, one of the oldest farm cooperatives in Iowa was up in Marcus, Iowa, and it was founded in 1887. These kind of worker cooperative organizations have been around for the history of the U.S. And show up clearest during economic downturns. Because we start thinking about the way that our society and our economy in particular is structured. But even today, one of the oldest and biggest co-ops has about 2,000 employees, and that's in New York City. And it's a cooperative of home care and home cleaning services. So these socialist organizations, if without necessarily defining it yet, but are around and have been around. We just often don't know they're there, and maybe don't know to call them that.
And I'll follow up too from a little bit more theoretical perspective that socialism really has its roots ultimately in the teachings of Karl Marx. And so it kind of comes out of the same thought of as communism does. The difference, though, or at least initially what the difference for democratic socialism was that the folks that wanted to attach that label really rejected the more authoritarian aspects of communism or straight socialism, and particularly didn't like the Stalinistic approach and some of the things you saw going on in the Soviet Union back in the early 1900s. And so that's basically an idea where it's more the community voting. And in terms of some of the things that you've seen, that certainly that you can find examples of smaller socialistic types of communities, whether you've got a co-op or something like that, or some of the communes that we saw perhaps in the 1960s, where the idea is that people are working together for society. But the question is as well, what can you do in a much larger economy such as that of the United States, and does it work? And as Karen was correctly pointing out, that you've got a situation in the United States right now where we're not completely capitalistic, that some of the excesses that we saw in capitalism in the 1800s, 1900s, and so on have been mitigated by a variety of more socialistic types of aspects. And the big question now, and perhaps what's prompting this show, is, well, how far down that road are we willing to go? And you have people, as you mentioned at the top, of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who really want to push us further, and that's caused a certain pushback from the right in particular. We're saying, well, we're going too far down that road, or at least faster than they want to go.
So there are so many. I want to just talk about local government for a little bit, because there are so many aspects of public health, public transportation, housing issues that are really social decisions and social control of things that we really need on a daily basis, but that we can't provide for ourselves as an individual. So, for example, water and sewer. Municipal water supplies, you're trying to get healthy water into people's homes and businesses. And with sewer systems, you're trying to get dirty water out of people's homes and businesses. And so those are things that are really hard for me to do as an individual, but as a municipality, as a community, we can pull our money and make decisions about how those things are run. And that is a form of democratic socialism. Our road systems certainly are another example of that.
I don't think that those kinds of infrastructure types of things would necessarily be inconsistent with capitalistic society. Now, I suppose maybe somebody who's pure capitalistic saying, oh, no, we're not going to do that. But sort of the way our system has run today, that most people, and again, I'm sort of thinking of the people on the right, how they would look at this, they generally don't have a problem with things like building roads or making sure water is pure. You think about what's going on in Flint and so forth. And those are not the kinds of things that the right usually complains about, unless, of course, you're spending too much money or wasting the money. It's more some of the other social aspects where it's a question of, can people really do for themselves, or is it just a matter of the government doing it for them? And that's the balance that they often want to try to find. And they, of course, want to strike that balance quite differently than people like, again, Sanders or AOC would do so.
But there are some communities that have private water companies. And so the motivation for those companies is not necessarily public health and making sure everyone has access to clean water. Their bottom line is making sure they make a profit, even if it's at the expense of public health. And so that's what that difference is between a private owned water company and a socially owned one through local government. And so even though the right might not be talking about that, they're still taking advantage of those socially owned and managed types of institutions that are really positive and important aspects of our culture, society, and public health.
If Karl will forgive me, Drew, how would you weigh in on this as an economist in terms of that profit motive? Is it a positive or a negative?
Well, I think the profit motive is it's not positive or it's negative. I mean, the results can have some really dire consequences, but they can also have had some remarkable positive consequences. The question, I think, in this democratic socialist idea, where it's not entirely a socialist society or a communistic society, but an economic system that is democratic and social, maybe within still a structure that utilizes markets and their efficiencies, is really about the distribution of this stuff. When we're thinking about cooperatives, one of the things that is true, and I guess maybe I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, is that profit increment on the price, those things that you don't see in these public goods that Karen's talking about, the profit increment on the price goes to all the workers. They can distribute it in a more equal way, and it doesn't lead to these sort of substantial inequalities that we can see within organizations where CEOs make tremendous times more than their median worker, and we're seeing a lot of that in the news today, particularly with the unionization effort by the Amazon employees. The profit motive for capitalism is really useful, and it's essential, in fact, the expectations of profits. When we get into the socialist sort of point of view, I think it is much more about the distribution of the means to live your life across a broader population.
Do you think that the profit motive drives innovation?
I think that it can, definitely. But I also think that under democratic socialism, that when you have a society where people are not spending most of their psychic energy and their physical energy every day just trying to survive, just trying to work 3 part-time jobs in order to just pay rent and just have a subsistence level of living, all of your creative energy is zapped out from that. And so I think that there are some positives from also making sure that people have some kind of minimum ability to live well and healthfully. And that also is another way of motivating the creative economy and motivating people to innovate and strive for more.
Yeah, I think the personal nature of innovation is really important, and we have healthy and are able to live flourishing lives, makes us better positioned to be innovative. But I don't think it's just profit. I think it's competition. I think it's the desire to be better, to have some accomplishments on your scorecard, and so. Certainly, when we structure the world in a capitalist economy, then profit motives and making more money than someone else can sort of help generate some of that innovation. But a huge amount of the innovation that we've seen in this country, Mariano Mazzucato has got a phenomenal book out, The Entrepreneurial State, that talks about how the state has been central to most of these major innovations. Being a huge generator of innovations, and that's not about profit, right? The profit comes on the back end of those when other private companies figure out how to sort of take advantage of some of these new developments. But the innovation is largely driven by public investment.
But there can still be competition and profit motive even within democratic socialism. You could have cooperatives or worker-owned businesses who are in competition with each other, trying to outdo the other group of people. And so it doesn't completely get all of those elements out of society.
But what do they get out of being in competition with other groups of people? What's the incentive?
Because in a socialist economy, there's still an economy, right? There's still an exchange of goods and services. And so it may be that the motivation for creating a product or a service is not about money, but you still make money. I mean, I'm a democratic socialist feminist who owns a business, and I'm in business. Money is not the number one reason. And so my mission and how I interact with my customers is very different than a shop owner who is in it for the money. How I recommend products and services are really about what their needs are, not about what my needs are. And hopefully, by meeting their needs, I can meet not my needs and keep the shop open. So I think that there's lots of different kinds of motivations and lots of different ways of having internal motivation for why you're in business. It doesn't mean that I won't compete with another shop down the street so that I can be the one to meet those people's needs.
Let me ask a question. Why do people only see it in the frame of you're taking resources from one group and giving it to maybe those who are less deserving? Why is that always the argument made, instead of that there's still competition and that resources are still given appropriately?
Well, part of the reason for that particular argument, I think, is that usually it is a matter of distribution, that you're distributing the goods to the people that need it. And Karen was kind of talking about this in terms of saying, well, we need to free up people's psychic energy and make sure that they don't have to worry about things just to survive a good standard of living. Well, okay, but if they're not doing something, whatever it happens to be, either because of a job or just no job, that they're just not working hard enough for whatever reason, either they can't or won't, somebody's got to pay for that standard of living that they're having. And that means taxing some other people, which then effectively becomes a redistribution. And that's one of the things that you see a lot of people, again, back to Bernie Sanders and AOC and Elizabeth Warren and some others, that talk about taxing people to a fair share, particularly people that make an awful lot of money, whether it's over $400,000 or whatever it happens to be, millionaires, billionaires. But the problem there is that a lot of times those people end up finding ways to not pay taxes. So then it ends up where the people in the middle class end up having to pay more taxes. And those are the ones that are sort of at sort of that bubble where if all of a sudden they're paying more taxes, now all of a sudden they're not living a life that they want to live. And even though they've struggled and they're working hard and they may be working 2 jobs, maybe not 3 jobs kind of a thing, but they're working overtime trying to make that payment for their mortgage or their luxury activities, whatever it happens to be, a boat or something like that. And so that's the thing that people get concerned about. And then, of course, you get into paying attention to various anecdotes, whether you do find somebody who isn't working as a slacker of some sort, but then the other side will say, yes, but here's this other person who can't work and this person needs to help. And so a lot of times people say, well, we're willing to give the help, but what about this other person who's not working very hard that should be able to? And that's where you get that back and forth.
You also have examples recently of the COVID stimulus checks that were going out, not only to people who needed it because they were on an unemployment. And so, I mean, that's an example of something that has happened recently. But to kind of get back to the point about people that have millions and billions every year coming in, we need to stop them from having so many loopholes for paying their fair share. When someone has $50 billion, if they had $1 billion less, they would not feel it in their daily lives. Their children and their children's children would not have less effective inheritance. And that $1 billion could be redistributed to make sure that children are not going hungry every night and that they have a bed to sleep in and that our educational system is what it needs to be and that there's affordable housing and health care for all. So I think we need to not just say we're going to tax people, we need to restructure the tax system so that those individuals and those corporations that are making lots of money pay into society. They have benefited from society. They need to pay in towards society.
Drew may want to weigh in on this, but I would say that the counter argument to that, to some extent, is that even if you change the tax laws, that those folks usually are well enough off that they can restructure their businesses, take them overseas, whatever it happens to be, so that they end up not paying anything. And it's the folks that are in that middle class that don't have that luxury to change their economic situation that end up getting stuck with the bill. And one last thing on that, and then again, maybe Drew would want to weigh in on this, is that the argument to some extent is that even if you tax a lot of these rich people 100%, that's not going to make a huge dent in the particular problem of childhood poverty or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, Tim, I think that's a great framing. And this discussion illustrates, I think, the problem inherent in Karl's question is that we are always thinking about this as a zero-sum game. We have to take from the rich to take care of these problems. But that, unfortunately, also is then buying into this notion that your tax money funds the government. It can't. By definition, for you to pay your tax in US dollars, the government had to spend it into the economy first. It's the only way to get it. So when you're taxing wealthy people, you're not actually providing Congress the ability to spend more money. They didn't go tax a bunch of people before they passed $3 trillion in COVID spending. They also didn't sell the bonds before they did it. Congress votes. Congress then tells how much the state how much to spend, and they do it. They're the only one that can create the money, so they just spend it. The taxes on the back end, if you want to talk about progressive taxation, that's absolutely a fundamental purpose for tax, is to work on the distribution of income and to limit any one actor's power within the state. But it doesn't provide the funding for public spending. At the state and local levels, it absolutely does, but not at the federal government. So if we want to aim at childhood poverty, we don't need to go, tax Jeff Bezos to get the money. Congress just needs to vote. There's a lot of problems with this, and I'm happy if this discussion kind of goes down this road. If it doesn't, the one thing I just would recommend is that people go buy Dr. Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. It's a New York Times bestseller. But this walks people through it in a really clear way so that we don't fall into this trap of thinking we need rich people's money to pay for important public services.
I think the other aspect of democratic socialism that we're really talking about the economy here, but it's also about the process of people being involved in decision making in terms of voting laws, making sure that people have access to the ballot box, that people are educated about issues, and making sure that laws about how you even get on the ballot are not so stacked towards the two major parties. And so when we talk about democratic socialism, from my perspective, we also need to talk about the democratic part of it, the democracy part of it. And I would love us to have some discussion about that as well.
Please. Does anyone want to follow up on that?
Maybe just to kind of go back to a little bit of the competition question that Tim asked too is, one of the nice things about co-ops is they stay small. Most co-ops, I think, are around 50 employees or less. Again, on the really big end, we're talking maybe 2,000 employees. Small companies are more competitive. They compete against each other. They innovate better. They take care of their customers better. When you get into what we've gotten into now with a capitalist system, kind of free from anti-trust regulation, is we're losing out on competition. Every industry you look at, there's 4 or 5 really big companies, and everybody else is tiny. They just have, every industry has got huge concentrations in just a few sort of seats of power within the sector. Co-ops, I think, offer a way of providing that sense of ownership, both monetarily, but also experientially through the voting process of co-ops, far more so than a regular corporate structure. And so I think it's a really important point, and I'm glad Karen wants us to keep it as part of the conversation going forward.
And I think there's some other kinds of institutions that are great examples. For example, community-owned banks who might be willing to take slightly larger risks with people who are traditionally marginalized from banking services, who might want to start a business or might need a loan to help an elderly parent get the health care they need, or that who want to buy a home. And we also know that when people can buy homes and have home ownership, that their families are healthier, their neighborhoods are healthier, their communities are healthier, and therefore the United States of America is healthier. And so publicly owned banks, food cooperatives, co-housing, where people may own their individual units as an individual, but that they work the neighborhood, they organize the neighborhood collectively. They might not all need to have a snowblower. Maybe they have a couple for the whole neighborhood. They might not each have to have a rototiller, but so people are cooperating. And so there are these socialistic values that are incorporated into these kinds of alternative institutions that are really effective for communities.
Tim?
Changing topics just a little bit, but staying on the point Karen made has to do with the ballot access and the two-party system. And I know a lot of people complain about it. I think it's pretty good in the sense that you sort of have two competing ideas, although they aren't static, in the sense that Republicans and Democrats, especially if you look over a long history, they're all kind of changing their views over things, whether it's domestic policy or foreign policy or what have you. But if you're looking to sort of increase the competition so that it's not two parties, the way to do that is often through local ballot access and local elections of various sorts. And you see that in a variety of ways. And every once in a while, that's able to break out and get something a little bit larger at the state level. You think of the Reform Party with Jesse Ventura in Minnesota. At the national level, though, it's pretty much going to be a spoiler more than anything else. But still at the local level is where you have to start.
Although just getting on the ballot, for example, in Iowa, if you want to get on a national ballot, the benchmark to get on there is so much different for a third party or an independent person than it is for the Democrats or the Republicans. And across the country, you have to know each state's higher restrictive qualifications to get on the ballot. And so it makes it very hard for someone wanting to run for president, for example, to be able to get on the ballots in all 50 states. And so then there's huge discussions about the quote unquote spoiler, but at some point, when do we get to really vote our hopes and not be voting our fears all the time, which is something I've personally had to deal with a lot in the last couple of elections. Not really having the right choice for me on the ballot, but being afraid of what's on there.
And Karen, I think that this comes back a lot to the same kind of this central framing about resources, and voting. One of the starkest things in comparing the United States to other countries is just how few of us vote. And one of the issues, and I think Karen, you just encapsulated it perfectly, is that people aren't voting for anything. And one of the ways that people are kept from voting from things is they're constantly told how we're going to pay for that, or it's going to increase the national debt. And this has put has just kept us locked into this framing, and as a result, people they can't vote for the candidates they want, because the candidates they want don't make it through the process, because they don't adhere to this notion that we don't have public money for some reason. Money is public. We can do with it what we decide to do with it electorally, including put a whole lot more voting booths and voting stations in neighborhoods all across the country. If the federal government can provide the resources for it, we could easily do it. And then we've got the problem at the state level, but the framing is the real struggle for me, I think.
And I think sometimes too, the word socialism, it's just kind of the boogeyman. And as someone who has been on ballots before, although in nonpartisan races, I was very much self-identified as a democratic socialist feminist. And people thought that they were voting for me in spite of my socialism, but really it was my viewpoints about public health, about housing, about clean streets, about public safety, that were part of my democratic socialist feminist values that they were actually appreciating.
Any final quick thoughts before we wrap up?
Don't be afraid to ask questions. If someone uses the word socialism, you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 different answers. And so there's so many flavors of socialism. It's really important just to have a really nice conversation like we had today.
Thank you. And that has to be our last word. We're out of time. We might not all agree on how to arrive at a place that pleases each citizen of our republic, but we all recognize that the current system is creating a wider gap between the haves and the have-nots. Democratic socialism is the desired system for some, which is common in Europe, preserves capitalism, but with stricter regulations and government programs to distribute resources more evenly. Can resources be distributed evenly across this nation? We won't be able during this conversation to solve this problem, but I do believe we should all be willing to discuss the issue more publicly. Thank you and good day, and thank you to our panelists for discussing such a heavy topic.
Thanks for hosting.